Greetings and salutations, Starshaped here with my thoughts on a potential patch for Warcraft 3. I've seen a lot of posts, a lot of videos from other people doing this type of thing, so I thought I would throw my hat into the ring as well, especially now that Blizzard has shown some signs of life. We have a PTR with profiles and some kind of ladder, I guess. So let's talk a little bit about what might be a nice patch. I'm going to go through each race individually, so human, orc, night elf, undead. And then we'll talk a little bit about items that I would like to see changed, a little bit about bugs I would like to see changed, and then some thoughts about the maps and map pool and as far as competitive Warcraft 3 is concerned. So let's just jump right into it. We'll start with human. So first I would revert the Spellbreaker armor nerf, so the -1 armor they received as a nerf previously. I would just take that away. I feel like the Spellbreaker is not dominating every matchup. It's not a very troublesome unit in that sense, and the one matchup where this buff, reverting this nerf rather, would help is against Night Elf, which seems to be a matchup that human is struggling in. So I think this makes a lot of sense. Just give them back that armor. Next, the blacksmith cost reduced to 140 gold, 140 wood, down from 140 gold and 60 wood. Together with the following long rifles, cost reduced to 75 gold, 90 wood, down from 75 gold, 125 wood. Both of these buffs I think would help both the expansion style of human and the one base style, making it more viable to do a rifle tech, for example, more viable to actually get those long rifles, even if you were perhaps harassed during the early game. So I think it's a well-needed buff for any style of human that you want to play. Peasant HP I would increase to 240 up from 230. It seems like peasants need a bit more resilience to deal with, again, whether you're teching or doing an expansion style, you're going to get your peasants right-clicked quite a bit, and let's give them some extra resilience to make it a little easier to deal with. Arcane Tower as well, I would change the cost to 100 gold and 30 wood, changed from 70 gold to 50 wood. I feel like getting that one Arcane Tower is so important for human, and it's really honestly quite expensive as far as the wood goes. So I just want to make it cheaper wood-wise and a little bit more expensive gold-wise, so it doesn't like come too quickly. It's not like free, but wood is the issue most of the time in the early game. And getting that Arcane Tower, especially if you're doing like a tech build, when I played human, it always kind of felt bad to do an Arcane Tower before teching because it slowed you down so much. So maybe this will give you a bit more leeway in getting an Arcane Tower no matter what style you're playing and getting it in time for when you need it as well. I would revert the tower repair buff, so the 5-second faster repair rate on towers I would just remove from the game. I don't think it serves a purpose. It's not necessary in the early game. It's only more impactful in certain like niche tower rush strategies, or if you have like an 80 food army and you're right clicking a tower in the late game and they can somehow just keep repairing it with, if they have enough peasants, like towers just don't die if you have enough repair, which I think is pretty bad for the game. So I would just remove that buff. Then we have the Sundering Blades, would no longer require an upgrade. So it would just be a passive for the knights. This might be too strong, I'm not really sure, but it feels like, human needs help against undead and against headhunters in general. So perhaps this would make knights more viable in both of those situations. I mean, they are a must-have unit against undead, and maybe they could be used against orc as well if they have this Sundering Blade already researched. And again, if you're doing like a tech build, it's just one less thing that you have to get. That's takes time and money. Finally, Orb of Fire, I would just reduce the cost to 275 gold, down from 325. So I feel like 325 is a bit too pricey for what it does. And again, if you're going to do a one-base style of human, it's a very expensive orb, and it is a situational orb, unlike all the other orbs in the game that are just always going to be useful. So I'd like to see it just reduced in cost. Moving on to Orc. Troll Headhunter attack range decreased to 500, down from 550. But in the same breath here, Troll Regeneration now also increases attack range to 550. So the Troll Headhunter would have 50 less attack range in the early game in the tier 1 stage, but once you get that troll regeneration, which you probably want to get no matter what, you'll also get the extra range back, so they'll be back to 550. This might be too small of a change, maybe it's too big of a change, but I feel like headhunters are mostly problematic in like how snowbally they are, and a lot of that comes down to the range. So perhaps this could mitigate some of those issues. Scroll speed, I would increase the cost to 100 up from 70. And I know that this item has already been nerfed from 50 to 70, but honestly, it's at 70 gold, it's still an auto buy. It's kind of a brainless, if you have an orc shop, if you click on the shop and you're an orc player and there's a scroll of speed available, you're going to buy it. Like no matter what, there's never a situation you're not going to buy it. So if we increase it to 100, perhaps it'll be more of a, skill choice to, do I need this speed scroll right now? Can I get it later? And so on. And especially, I think in like modern Warcraft 3 at the very top level, the scroll of speed is just like, it's way too good in the hands of a good player. It's like the ultimate defensive tool and the ultimate offensive tool in the same item. So I would just nerf it to 100 to begin with. Grunt armor I would increase to 2 up from 1. So Orc seems to struggle against Night Elf, and this would also help in the mirror matchup where, if you're deciding whether you want to go Headhunters or Grunts, maybe this will be more viable to go Grunts. And again, the extra armor would help against Night Elf, where we do see a lot of Grunts still as the normal opener. I would also revert the Serpent Ward experience bounty. So they would go from the 12.5, 30, 42.5 experience per ward to back to 12.5, 20, 30 as they were before. I feel like this the Serpent Wards really only kind of come into play in one matchup against Night Elf, and it's one of those matchups where Orc needs help more so than Night Elf. So I would just start by reverting this to give Night Elf a little less experience in those drawn out fights. Reinforced defenses I would rework into 2 upgrades. We'd have reinforced burrows unlocked at tier 2, and they would cost 50 gold, 100 wood. And then reinforced watchtowers unlocked at tier 3 for 25 gold, 75 wood. So you'll notice that the cost here is literally just split into 2. And this way, Orc players can still get that safe fortified burrow situation going for a fairly cheap cost. But we wouldn't see too early fortified towers being used for laming purposes and expansions. You'd still need to go tier 3 for that. But you could potentially use a burrow as a tower, a proxy burrow, when you're trying to expand. So it doesn't really make a tier 2 expansion unviable, I think. Liquid Fire would no longer reduce attack speed of targeted structures. So if I use a Liquid Fire bat on a tower, it would still attack as fast as it did before. So it wouldn't get slowed down, which I think would help quite a bit against bat laming. Yeah, that's the final one is that Pillage gets moved to the barracks because, if it's in the Great Hall, you're probably never going to get it at tier 1 because it slows down your tech, and slowing down the tech is just not acceptable, especially these days. Teching as fast as possible is vital for pretty much every race. So if we move it to the barracks, perhaps we'll see some tier 1 Pillage, perhaps we'll see, if you're getting it during your tech or at some other point in the game. I don't think it's a big change, nothing radical, just let's move it to the barracks and see what happens. All right, let's move on to Night Elf. Night Elf sees some radical changes, and this is where you might just pause the video and hate me, but bear with me as we go through Night Elf. Starting off with, I would just revert the Druid of the Claw mana buff, so the bears would no longer have 125 starting mana. It would be back to 100, because I feel like this is one of those buffs that I grossly underestimated. I thought that this would not matter at all, but it turns out that with this buff you just have endless rejuvenation as Night Elf. And again, just like the Scroll of Speed, where it's like it's a no-brainer, you never have to really strategically think about how you use your bears because you always just have infinite rejuves. Like I find myself rejuvenating like a 10 HP to get 10 HP extra, just because I have 50 rejuvenations in my army. So it's like I would just revert this because it makes the bear less strategic. It just dumbs down the game a bit, and it's like Night Elf does not need that much rejuvenation, in my opinion. I'd also rework Wellspring, so it no longer increases storage by 125. Instead, it regenerates mana also during the day. So my reasoning here is that, you know, if you have a late game Night Elf base with like 7-8 Moonwolves and they're all full with Wellspring, it's just such a defensive stronghold. It's so hard to assail Night Elf, and it can kind of make you play in a very kind of defensive turtley way or a very safe way, because you know that you have that indomitable base waiting for you. Whereas if we do make this change, it would encourage players to be more active on the map, be more aggressive, more flexible, you know, try to get as much mana from those Moonwolves as possible by trying to get them to regenerate at all times when you do have the Wellspring upgrade. Hunter's Hall cost, I would reduce to 210 gold, 80 wood, down from 210 gold and 100 wood. Kind of similar to the blacksmith here. 100 wood is a very, very steep investment. And I'm thinking mostly in terms of like a Hunter's Tech, because I feel like Hunter's Tech is not as viable as it used to be back in the day, because it's such a heavy investment. It slows down your tech so much. So let's just reduce the cost of the Hunter's Hall a little bit to make the Hunter's Hall come online a bit cheaper. At the same time, I would also increase the build time to 70, up from 60, so that we wouldn't see faster mass hunts, for example, because that could break the game. So, you know, it can come out faster, but it'll still cost time-wise, makes up for it. So the mass hunt style would come out at about the same time as it does now. All right, let's continue with Night Elf. There are more points. So here's where the more radical changes occur. Bear with me. Hunter's armor type changed to heavy from unarmored. And of course, we cannot do this in a vacuum. We cannot only change the armor type. It would break the game in every single matchup. So we also have to keep going with the Hunter's bounce attack is removed. So it would just be a single attack, but the Moonglaive is split into 2 upgrades, and the first bounce is unlocked at tier 2 for 50 gold and 75 wood, and then the second bounce is unlocked at tier 3 for 50 gold and 75 wood. So we do have the bounce attack, but it's just not available at tier 1. You have to research it at tier 2 and then tier 3 if you want to get the full bounce. I'd also increase the cost of Huntress to 210 gold, 20 wood, up from 195 gold, 20 wood. Again, this would make the matchup against Orc a little bit harder for Elf, having, you know, more expensive Huntresses when it's a matchup where you tend to make a lot of them. And as well, I think that if we do make all these changes to the armor type and stuff, the Hunters will be a stronger unit overall, so it should be a bit more expensive. Also, the Hunter's bounce attack no longer affects buildings, because especially, you know, if we have heavy armored Huntresses, we might just get like Siege Bears 2.0 with the bounce attack on buildings. So we'll just remove that entirely, make it only bounce on units. Here comes another huge change. Fairy Dragon combat damage removed. So I would just make it so Fairy Dragons would no longer have combat damage. They have their phase shift and their mana flare, and that's it. And again, another drastic change here. Dryad poison damage no longer stacks. So these 2 changes, the Fairy Dragon and the Dryad, are simply to make it so you can't mass one type of unit the entire game and win. Because I feel like Night Elf right now is the only race that does that. It's the most problematic race when it comes to army composition. There are so many, you know, top level strategies that are just revolved around expanding and then massing one type of unit. Whether it's mass Dryads, mass Fairies, even mass Hunts against Orc. So with these 2 changes to Fairy Dragons and Dryads, I would hope to see, not that expansion styles stop working, but rather that Night Elf would have to make a more mixed and balanced army. And again, if we have unarmored Huntresses, Night Elf is always stuck in this huge conundrum, which is, you know, how do I make a decent army composition when Huntresses are unarmored, Dryads are unarmored, Druid of the Talon are unarmored. There's so much unarmored units for Night Elf unless you go to Bears. So it's like, you know, it's so hard to do anything other than, you know, mass Dryads or mass Fairies, whatever, if you're staying at tier 2. Because, you know, if you overcommit to an unarmored army, then all of a sudden Piercing or Siege will just destroy you. So all these changes in conjunction, I think, or hope, would make it so that We could see more varied Night Elf armies and more varied Night Elf openers, whether it's archers or huntresses. I would also move Ultravision to tier 2, and I would move it from the Hunter's Hall to the Tree of Ages or Tree of Eternity. So I feel like Ultravision is a bit too strong, especially against Orc. If you have Huntresses, Entangle, and Ultravision, that's a lot of bonus information that you have, and bonus map control that you have that your opponent doesn't. But also, I think just in general in every matchup, I think Ultravision is a bit too good. So it can definitely just be moved to tier 2. And moving it to the main, I think, for one, it makes it so you don't have to get a Hunter's Hall, obviously. So if you're doing a strategy that doesn't rely on Hunter's Hall, you can still get Ultravision. But also, it's a bit of a tactical choice, because a lot of times you want to rush tier 3, you want to see it tier 2. But now you'd have to stop and think a little bit, like, do I want to invest a little bit of time to get that Ultravision, or do I want to go straight to tier 3 instead? All right, that was Night Elf. Let's talk about Undead. Undead, I would make it so the Obsidian Statue initial mana is down to 300 from 400. And crucially, I would also make Spirit Touch restore 2 mana to friendly units down from 3. Because I think the Obsidian Statue is by far the best unit in the game. It's in a league of its own. It's completely bonkers and has been for a long time. And I think it is one of the biggest issues in the game right now. So it just needs to be nerfed, both the mana pool and the mana that it gives. So that's why I did those 2 changes. I'd also increase Ghoul armor from to 1 up from 0. Kind of same reasoning as with the Grunt. Make Ghouls a bit more resilient and make them more viable in the early game and make them scale a bit better. Help them deal a bit more with Headhunters, Huntresses, even Crypt Fiends, stuff like that. I'd also make it so Cannibalize no longer requires an upgrade. And this might be too drastic, I'm not sure. It might just make Undead or like Ghouls in general too versatile in the early game especially, but I'd like to see it tried at least. So that you can creep more easily without skeletons, without Death Coil. You don't have to waste time waiting for that Cannibalize to take time away from crypt production. Nerubian Tower, I would also make it so the Frost attack is decreased to 3 seconds, down from 5. 5 I think is just ridiculous. It should never be that high. I think 3 is still quite a bit, considering how cheap the tower is. So let's just start with that and see what happens. And kind of hand in hand with the Cannibalize change, I would make it so the Rod of Necromancy gives 2 charges instead of 4. But at the same time, I'd also make it cost 75 gold. So half the cost, half the charges. Again, if you have Cannibalize, skeletons won't be as important for creeping. And just kind of a bit of a nerf to their aggressive potential. Because, they wouldn't restock. They would restock as often as they do now. But so you just have fewer charges of skeletons to work with. And I think that's pretty healthy. Again, like Rod of Necromancy is one of those items where over time, as players have gotten better and better, we've kind of seen how incredibly powerful that item is. Like, just for scouting, for last hitting, for harassing, for whatever. And they're just a bit too strong, I think. Finally, Haunted Goldmine now provides Mining Acolytes with a 10% damage reduction from attacks and spells. Undead has always been in that kind of special situation where if you're a Night Elf or human and you lose a gold mining worker, you can just replace it from wood. Take a woodworker and replace it and you're fine. But obviously Undead cannot do that, so let's give them a little bit of help keeping those acolytes alive. And I think this could be a pretty healthy change, because it's a really feels bad kind of situation if you're playing Undead and you just lose an acolyte during tech and all of a sudden you're thrown back into the Stone Age as far as your economy goes. So I think that's a pretty good change as well. Finally, web research cost reduced to 50 gold, 100 wood, down from 150 gold and 150 wood. There's not a whole lot to say here. 150 gold, 150 wood is an insane amount to ask for web. I have no idea why it costs so much. It definitely shouldn't cost that much. So let's just make it quite a bit cheaper. All right, let's talk a little bit about items. I don't have too much to say here, but Wand of Illusion, I would make it so that it has 2 charges instead of 3. Again, kind of like the Rod of Necromancy, it feels like one of those items that as the game gets older and players get better and better, we've seen how powerful the Wand of Illusion is. 3 charges is just, it gives you too much, in my opinion. You can use them so efficiently as scouting tools. You can pull creeps with them, you can block with them, you can surround with them, and so on and so on. So I would just reduce the charges. And kind of in the same vein here, sentry wards now contain 1 charge down from 2. So 2 sentry wards, especially, and we're going to talk about maps later, but especially on modern maps that are usually very, very small, having 2 charges of sentry ward is basically like having map hack. So I would just give it 1 charge instead of 2. It'd still be a really good item. And I would also change the name to sentry ward. So we'll remove the plural there. Finally, Wand of Mana Stealing is no longer a charged item. Instead, it has a cooldown of 60 seconds. And for reference, Staff of Preservation has a cooldown of 45 seconds. So 60 seconds is quite a bit. This might be too strong. This might be bonkers. I don't know. But I always feel like Wand of Mana Stealing just feels so much worse than the other items. One of the classic suggestions is that it steals 75 mana instead of 50. But I thought this might be a more interesting way to approach it. Just make it a reusable item with a cooldown. Again, at 60 seconds, I feel like you'd probably use it still just like once in a fight, but it would still be more versatile as far as, you can run around, harass, and steal mana and stuff like that. Maybe steal mana from creeps as well when you're creeping without having to, waste a charge. All right, let's talk a little bit about bug fixes that I would like to see. Creeps can no longer be prevented from casting spells by using Windwalk in a certain way. So, for example, the Forest Troll High Priest on Last Refuge, we've probably all seen this where the Blade Master Windwalks and then attacks at a certain angle, so the troll doesn't cast any spells, and you can creep it so much faster than anyone else can do it because there's no inner fire going on. I would remove that. Creeps can no longer be prevented from casting spells by pulling them out before engaging. So, classic example, the Rock Golem, you pull it out and then you engage the creep camp and it doesn't throw any boulders for some reason. I would definitely fix that bug as well. And finally, creeps can no longer be made to move excessively far away by exploiting unsummon/repair. So again, we've seen this a lot recently. And Night Elf player is Ancient War creeping the green camp, and Acolyte shows up and pulls the creeps away, which is fine. That's always been in the game. But then the creeps keep chasing the Acolyte and keep chasing it, and it just goes on like almost forever. It's an absurdly long distance they run because they're exploiting this unsummon bug. So I would fix that as well. I don't know if these 3 bugs are fixable, but if they are, I would gladly see them all removed from the game. All right, finally, let's talk a little bit about maps in competitive Warcraft 3. We can talk about maps as balancing tools. We can talk about map sizes then and now. And then what do we want to see going forward? And maps as balancing tools is, the classic example is from StarCraft. So this is Lost Temple. And in StarCraft, Lost Temple, basically you have your main, and then there's a little ramp going down to the low ground. So the only entrance into your base is this little ramp, and then there's an expansion right next to it with a kind of semi-choke here, and that leads out into the rest of the map. And every base has a similar kind of setup. And this is just like what pops into my head when I think about maps as balancing tools, because I know for a fact that the balance in StarCraft was terrible. Because the maps were wide open, so people would just mass their holdings and destroy you, and there's no efficient way to defend yourself. But if you have a small little ramp, you can build a bunker here or whatever. You can make a photon cannon or something, and you can protect your main. You can have an easy access to your expansion. So if you look at competitive StarCraft today, everything's kind of based on this model where you have to have a safe main and you have to have a safe expansion, and then there's variations after that, but there's always this kind of core principle. And I always thought that was kind of interesting, that the balance really is dependent on maps. It's not just the game balance, what the unit stats or cost, but it's also a very specific balance created around what a map can and can't be. So if you look at competitive StarCraft today, you'll never ever see a wide open map. You just can't do it because it's not balanced. So I think that's pretty interesting to think about. And let's look at some old maps. This was in the ladder in Reign of Chaos. It's called Legends. It's 104 by 104. But it feels a lot bigger than that, trust me. And just looking at the design here, the distances from main to main is really huge, and the distances from someone's expansion to someone's main, or even someone's expansion to someone's natural expansion, is really huge as well. There's a lot of creeps in the way. It's a really massive map. Similarly, so we have Nullwood, 128 by 128. This is more considered a 2-2 map today, but this was also pretty standard one. So one map back in the day. Again, huge map if it's cross spawn. Like the distance to go from your main here, past the creep camps here, past these creeps you can run into, and you have to get to your opponent here. Tranquil Path, same thing. I think this was in the Reign of Chaos ladder way back in the day. 128 by 128, and a very winding map. Like if you want to go from the one main here to someone else's main, you're going for a very, very long walk. And similarly, so like the expansions. If you start down here, you want to get to that expansion. That's a long trek. Lost Temple, classic map, even in Warcraft. It used to be played a lot in 1 vs 1 as well. Again, today it's a 2 vs 2 map, but back in the day, this was a competitive 1 vs 1 map. And again, if it's like cross spawn, like the time it takes, and even the navigation it takes to get to your opponent's natural expansion or main, it's so huge. Compared, of course, to what we have a lot today, like Amazonia, 80 by 80, rush distance, zoop, you're there in 2 seconds. Rush distance to the expansion, zoop, it's super close by. Echo Isle, same thing. It's just like a straight line, and you're there. 116 by 84, same thing to the expansions. And this is still considered one of the more, economy-friendly maps where it's more viable to fast expand. Last Refuge, 84 by 84. Rush distance is still very, very short, and it's very short to get to the expansion as well, because the expansion goes towards your opponent rather than away from them. So I just show these images just to kind of compare and contrast to what maps used to be and what they seem to be today. And a lot of this affects balance, of course. So all the human buffs I mentioned today, I would absolutely not make a single one of them if these were the maps. If we were playing on these maps today, I would never ever buff human because they wouldn't need it. But again, we're not playing those maps, we're playing these maps. And it's just an interesting question, how do we want the game to progress as far as balance, as far as the maps go? Do we want these tiny maps? Do we want every single map to be a variation of Amazonia? Because that kind of feels like what it is right now. Or do we perhaps want to experiment a bit more with some bigger maps? Especially these days when it seems like Undead can fast expand, Night Elf can fast expand, Human can fast expand. I guess the only problem would be if we played a huge map like this today, I feel like Orc would be left in the dust because they don't really have an option to expand early. So that's one big issue for me. But I do kind of miss having some bigger maps to watch and play, and not just have the same game over and over again on a tiny map like Amazonia or Echo Isles. So yeah, it's just some of my thoughts. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.